Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
Nine, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio, coming to you direct from our super secret studio in the third sub-basement of the Ministry of Snark in Washington, D.C., and from other undisclosed locations across America and around the world.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and it's that time of the week when we discuss big issues that have to do with the law. And we are fortunate to have with us somebody who has been not only a significant voice in Washington on a variety of critical issues, but who has also appeared here and been extremely well received for his wisdom and insight. Noah Bookbinder has been the president of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, known to many of you as CREW, since March 2015. He previously served as director of the Office of Legislative and Public Affairs at the U.S. Sentencing Commission and as chief counsel for criminal justice for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. How are you today, Noah?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Well, I'm doing what everybody does at this time of year. It's like, in November, December, it's holiday time. People decorate. They sit around the Christmas tree or the Hanukkah menorah. They do family things. In late June, on Thursdays at 10 in the morning, everybody gathers around their television now, and they wait for the Supreme Court to tell us what the Constitution really means. It used to be that knowing the Constitution would give you some idea of how this would turn out, but that's not the case anymore. Do you join in this holiday, this sort of festivus of summer?
I mean, I'd say reluctantly. I would. It's so important, some of the issues that we're waiting on the court for, that I think anybody who cares about the state of this country has to pay attention. But it's with a sense of dread often. It's hardly holiday joy.
Yeah, well, that's true. But so here's a paradox. As you guys and others have pointed out, the Supreme Court has some ethical challenges that it faces, more than any Supreme Court I remember in my lifetime, although we've certainly had some bad apples as Supreme Court justices over time. And it has also, for ideological reasons, quite apart from whatever those ethical problems are, embarked on a path in which things like stare decisis or precedent, the law as it appears, the law as it has been applied in the past, even common sense aren't used in rulings. And at the same time, they'll go back into the 13th century to find something that supports it. They're kind of legal. They're not strict constructionists, as some of them describe themselves. I would say they were more legal contortionists, trying to find law that suits their ideological perspective. And yet, there has been very little inclination on the part of those who oversee them, or on the part of the executive branch, to do anything at all to fix it. And I find that a conundrum, and I'm wondering what your view is.
Yeah, I mean, it is. There's clearly something that needs to be fixed here. The levels of the sort of different levels of with ethical problems, and what at this point is hard to argue as anything other than bias, than a specific result they're looking for, are untenable. So we have members of the court, most outrageously Justice Thomas, accepting at this point millions and millions of dollars in gifts from very wealthy people who have very clear interest in how the court rules, and in many, many cases not disclosing it as required. So that going on. And Justice Thomas is the worst example, but he's not the only example. It is not just one side of the ideological spectrum. And you had a court that up until very recently was about the only place in America that didn't have a code of conduct. The rest of us, when we go to work, have ways that we need to act. It's subject to all kinds of pressure. The court put into place a kind of anemic code of conduct with no enforcement mechanism, and continue to say, we're in charge of each one of us decides whether we did something wrong, and if so, what to do about it. And again, I think that's the kind of thing that Americans understand, that much as we'd love to believe that we always could police ourselves, that's not how humans work. You need some oversight. And on top of that, top of the sort of the ethical issues, you do have this this real appearance of bias. I think when we were in front of the Supreme Court earlier this year, we were representing Colorado Republican and unaffiliated voters moving under the Constitution to enforce the disqualification of Donald Trump under the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which I continue to believe is legally pretty clear. The Supreme Court sort of lost its nerve and kind of found a technicality to let him off on, but didn't take any issue with the actual finding that he had engaged in insurrection. When we went up there, I really wanted to believe that whatever issues I might have with the Supreme Court, they were serious. They were not. They might have political orientations, but they weren't going to, let those cloud their judgments. And it's harder and harder to continue believing that, not just because they got that one, very, very wrong, but because we now know that Justice Alito it was on multiple occasions flying flags from his various houses that are associated with Donald Trump's effort to overturn the election. He hasn't taken any responsibility for that. He hasn't recused himself, even though it is hard to do anything other than reasonably doubt his impartiality, which is the standard for when you should recuse. So it's gotten to a sort of outrageous pass. And I think Congress tends to defer to the Supreme Court. They don't want to have a fight across branches of government, but they really need to, because the court is not taking care of its own business. And it is well past time for some real oversight for Congress.
Yeah, it seems perverse that, the Supreme Court has a strict dress code, but not a strict ethics code. But they will all have to wear black robes. But beyond that, they're on their own. But it does raise a question. What should be done? Some of the Senate oversight committees have said, well, we're going to go and look into this. But it also looks like the Supreme Court wouldn't cooperate with that. And Chief Justice Roberts has said, we don't get into this kind of stuff. We're above it all. And that above it all quality creates a real problem because that makes them more independent and hard to rein in. Meanwhile, the president of the United States, current president, when he came into office, there was some talk, let's have a commission. That fizzled. It was that nobody really wanted to get into the issue of, do you have more Supreme Court justices? Do you have term limits and so forth? So my question is, on ethics and on bias, on the dysfunctionality of the court, what should we do?
It's a good question. It's a hard question because, as you point out, there isn't really anybody with authority over the U.S. Supreme Court other than the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the first thing I think that we need to be doing is continuing to ratchet up the public pressure. Because as much as they act like they are above it all, and they certainly are acting like they are above it all, they do read the newspaper. They do care what people criticize them. You've seen Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Chief Justice Roberts making these extraordinary public statements kind of defending themselves, which they don't usually do because they are feeling the heat. And I think, we need to continue yelling and screaming about this. Congress needs to continue holding hearings and writing letters and doing all the things that sort of raise the pressure. Because one thing that can happen is Chief Justice Roberts can get his own house in order. He's in charge over there. And, I think he has this sort of old school idea that the justices have to be collegial. They have to respect each other. They don't know justice pushes too hard. And it all kind of works, except now it's clearly not working. And he has come out and said, we have a way of doing things, which is that justices make their own decisions on recusal and on ethics. And that's clearly not working. And so I think we need to continue putting real pressure on him. And, the more that the public turns against the court, which the polls are made very clear that the court is held in lower esteem than it maybe ever has been, the more somebody like Chief Justice Roberts, who whatever else he may care about, he certainly cares about that institution. That he we hope will at some point feel compelled to take some action to, potentially go to Justice Alito and say, this is untenable, you got to recuse. To go back to that ethics code and say, we need to put in some form of enforcement and oversight, maybe a panel of retired judges who will evaluate ethical questions when they come up and tell us what we should do. So that's one thing that needs to happen. Another is that Congress needs to be more aggressive. They do have both oversight authority over the court, and they also control the funding for the court. And they don't want to overstep. They don't want to overly try to control another branch of government. But they do have levers they can use, and I think they really need to, this is the time to be pulling those levers. There are folks in the Senate and in the House who are introducing legislation that would change, that would add term limits, that would require an ethics code that has enforcement mechanisms, but they need to sort of turn up the volume on that. I think the president's in a really tough spot. He is out there trying to, I think very appropriately, make the case that democracy and checks and balances are both in danger and something that is really important. And I think it is hard to be out there making that case if you are also very publicly taking steps that look like you're meddling in another branch of government. So I think he's in a tough place. But I do think it's gotten to a point where if the Supreme Court won't do anything to clean its own house, somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, no question about it. It is a difficult problem for the president with regard to him trying to take the high road and respect the separation of powers. But on the one hand, respecting one, constitutional principle, if it's going to lead to a group of people being able to undermine other constitutional principles, is, it seems to be a tactical error if you respect the Constitution. But let's go to a couple of things that, people ask about and sort of drill down a little bit. You talked about the Congress being able to move the court to term limits or to control spending to the court, perhaps withhold spending from the court. Those are acknowledged powers of the Congress. But one of the more controversial issues is, should the size of the court be changed? But isn't it true that the size of the court has been changed in the past? And that, in fact, and I'm not advocating one side or the other, and I'm not asking you to advocate one side or the other, but in fact, used to be that the number of Supreme Court justices and the number of circuits they oversaw lined up. And I think that's no longer alignment, right? There's now 9 justices and 13 circuits or something like that, which suggests, a rationale at least might exist for a different size court.
I mean, it is clearly legally possible to change the size of the court. As you said, it's been done at different points in American history. That the Constitution doesn't set out the size of the court. It clearly gives the power to Congress to decide how many judges at different levels there will be. So that power is clearly there. I think there are arguments for changing the size of the court. I think that it's something, if Congress thinks about it, if a president thinks about this, it has to be something that can be done in a way that both doesn't just look like a power grab and then also doesn't immediately open the door for somebody else to come in and you get sort of that one person raises it to 11, the next president raises it to 13, and it sort of goes back and forth. So I think that solutions that have something like term limits and automatic appointment of a certain number of justices by each president look pretty fair, right? It's that if justices, after a certain number of years, they're done, president appoints new justices, each president gets to do this. In some ways, something like that is hard to argue with. And it has a certain appeal to it that something like just adding, 5 justices tomorrow might not have. At the same time, changing the number of justices and adding a number of them is potentially a way to fix some of the problems right away. So I think it's something that ought to be seriously considered and ought to be studied. But I think you got to do it really carefully if you go in one of those directions.
Are we, by focusing on these problems with the judiciary, ignoring others that are just as important, we have seen developments, for example, that are, sort of clearly amount to kinds of court packing on lower courts and putting in justices who are unqualified. And it's now led to, venue shopping, because if you're in front of the Fifth Circuit, they're going to be kind of ideologically right-leaning, or if you're in front of the Ninth Circuit, you think that maybe kind of ideologically left-leaning, or if you're in front of Eileen Cannon, well, she's sui generis. But this is not an accident, right? That we talk a lot about the Federalist Society, but there has been an effort, not for a few years, for decades on the part of certain people to try to influence the way judicial appointments go. And that has included, as we have seen, people on in the legislative body like Mitch McConnell playing absolute hardball, as he did with certain Supreme Court justices, blocking people and so forth. And that kind of behavior is only getting worse. It's the Congress is sort of not doing its job for political reasons, which makes it more likely that the courts are unable to do theirs for political reasons.
That's right. I mean, there has been a campaign for decades, particularly from the right. The left has been sort of trying to make similar efforts, but years and years and years behind, to shape what the courts would look like. I mean, there's a reason that despite the presidential elections in this country leaning one way over the past 30 or so years, the court is tipped in a very different direction, and that's because people like Mitch McConnell have consistently changed the rules and played hardball and kept out nominees and pushed for long periods of time, pushed through other nominees in short periods of time. None of that is an accident. And more broadly with the judiciary, there were all kinds of processes in place to try to ensure some professionalism and some sort of nonpartisanship among judges. There was the American Bar Association reviews the qualifications of judges. There's this so-called blue slip process where home state senators weigh in on potential judicial nominees. They used to be that nominees wouldn't move forward if they didn't have approval from their home state senators. There were processes within the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate as a whole to try to ensure that judicial nominations moved forward when there was a certain degree of consensus. That has, sort of bit by bit, broken down and fallen away. And even now, there is a sense that some presidents more than others, some parties more than others, will push their people through, and steamroll over those kinds of checks that are meant to kind of keep things more even-keeled. And in terms of forum shopping, it goes to the extent that there is a judge in Texas who is in a specific courthouse in a specific sort of department within one federal district, where under current rules you can bring a case in front of that judge or in that part of Texas, and you're going to get in front of that judge who happens to be known as a pretty ideological Donald Trump appointed judge. And so you have right-wing groups espousing political causes, finding any excuse to get into that particular court in Texas, and they know their judge is going to go their way. And that's how the Mifepristone case got as far as it did. And there is now legislation in Congress to limit forum shopping, to limit choosing your judge, choosing your place to bring it so that the result will go your way. That ought to be an easy bipartisan fix, because none of us should want specific parties choosing friendly judges to get the result that they want. It's not clear that it's going to be because of the extent to which both have become polarized and because some actors in our system are much better at manipulating the system right now.
Yeah, and some of those who are not so good, do ultimately get overruled despite all the problems that we've talked about. It's just happened moments ago, by the way, with one of the four cases the court ruled on today, where they overruled a decision of that Fifth Circuit on retaliatory arrest. What they didn't do was make a ruling on Trump's immunity. They didn't make a rule on Chevron deference. They didn't make a rule on, the January 6th cases, which gets to another issue. The most people, except like professional nerds, like you and I, they don't like pay attention to the nuts and bolts of how the Supreme Court operates behind the scenes. But people who do pay attention to those things have cited several problems. One is the court is increasingly behind schedule this year, way behind schedule. They push off lots of things. The court used to be, over sort of roughly by now. Now they're going to go into July. Those delays have consequences. It's not, just take the immunity case, which I would argue should never have been granted cert and should never have been heard by the court. But, we're like 6 months later now. There has been a legal effect, not to mention an electoral effect of the delays of a court that's overwhelmed. Another thing is that they've gone into the business of year-round kind of off-the-books rulings, which people, that's kind of new and maybe a little bit disturbing. What, if anything, worries about you about this stuff, about the sort of how the court works behind the scenes?
Yeah, we're in a situation where the court has tremendous effect without even having to do the hard work of making rulings, of writing things that people might disagree with. So the delay is a really, really powerful example of that. This immunity case is outrageous for a lot of reasons. I agree with you that it never should have gone to the Supreme Court. It's not hard legally. Of course, the president does not have absolute immunity. I think that's some obvious truth. It actually was very, very disturbing, the extent to which in the arguments about that, some of the members seemed more open to a truly outrageous idea than you would have hoped. But I don't think even they will find absolute immunity for the president. If there is some immunity, it shouldn't go anywhere near the facts of this January 6th, this effort to overturn the election. I'm less worried that they will see it that way. But even all of that aside, this is something, this is a case of enormous national significance where a trial in 2024, I think, continues to be incredibly important for this country moving forward. And the Supreme Court is making that as difficult as possible, not by what they rule, but just by the timing of it. They didn't expedite in the first instance when they could have, when Jack Smith asked them to take the matter before it went to the appeals court. And then, in our case, in our Colorado 14th Amendment case, which was, I also think wasn't a terribly difficult case on the law, but they were able to move quickly on that case. I think they got it very wrong. But they recognized that the Colorado primary was coming up, and they moved less quickly than I would have liked, but still more quickly than the Supreme Court normally moves. This immunity case is much easier. And yet we're now at, I think, something like 4 weeks longer than they took to decide that 14th Amendment case. And even if they were to come out tomorrow and say, of course, the president doesn't have immunity, the case can move ahead, we're now in a situation where the district court has a time pressure that it didn't need to have. We are still going to be pushing for that case to move forward this year. I still think it can happen, but it's going to be awfully, awfully difficult in a way that it just didn't have to be, because they have unnecessarily delayed. And it seems to be, it goes back to your statement before, that they're sort of above it all, that they feel like them making a decision is the most important thing. and everything else just has to wait. The world doesn't actually work that way. And that there are consequences in the rest of the world when they don't act. And I think that their unwillingness to acknowledge that is incredibly destructive.
Yeah, and it's also, one of those manifestations of bias. It's not only that they took a long time, by the way, they didn't have to take the case, and that could have instantly resolved the matter. And I think with regard to this case, if I recall correctly, the decision by the lower court was extremely detailed and well argued and well substantiated. And in any rational world, they wouldn't have taken the case. And I'll tell you, my secret fear, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a podcaster. We have an enormous amount of power, of course, but my fear is that they're going to say, well, of course presidents don't have blanket immunity, but they do have immunity in certain specific cases, and we're going to define that as broadly as we possibly can, but we're going to leave it to the lower court. So, Judge Shutkin, you tell us what you think there is immunity and which isn't. And if we don't agree, we're going to be right back here again for another chapter of this saga, and that it could just punt it down the road even further. Is that ludicrous?
I think not only is it not ludicrous, I think that is, I hate to say this, but it seems to me that is probably the most likely scenario, is that they are going to say there is sometimes immunity. They're going to define it pretty broadly. They're going to say, but it's not our job to apply that to the facts. That's you, trial court. You hold a hearing to discuss, to have that argued, and you issue a decision. And if Donald Trump doesn't like that decision, he can appeal it. And if the past is a guide, they're not going to expedite that appeal either. I think that then if that happens, Judge Chutkan is in a very difficult position where she may want to interpret that in a way that is more deferential to Donald Trump than is appropriate, in the hopes that it won't then have to go back up to the Supreme Court. I think that's a really alarming place for it to be. I think we're going to be pushing, if we end up in it. I mean, I'm still hopeful, even if not optimistic, that the Supreme Court is just going to find that whatever immunity may exist doesn't apply here, and this case can go forward. But if we are in this place where they remand, where they send it back to the district judge to make further findings, we're going to be pushing for her to move as quickly as possible and also as decisively as possible to kind of knock this down and go forward. But the Supreme Court has created this situation where quick and decisive may be pushing in opposite directions. And that's really alarming.
Yeah, it's also contrary to precedent, which again, we only used to care about precedent, but in Nixon and Watergate, or in Bush v. Gore, they moved quickly. I think in Bush v. Gore, they moved in 3 days to make a decision because they thought it was in the public interest. It would clearly be in the public interest to know whether the president of the United States was judged by, or a candidate for president was judged by a court, to have incited an insurrection prior to an election. But in the scenario just described, they could, it goes to Chutkan, she makes a decision, it gets appealed. They have a certain period for the appeal. The court's back in session in the fall. They agree to hear it. And then, there's no decision for X number of months thereafter. And so, whatever their ruling may be, the ruling to take and delay the case was among the most consequential legal decisions that they've undertaken.
Absolutely right. And there was absolutely no need for it. This is not, there was no significant dispute as to whether presidents have absolute immunity. Nobody's ever found that. It may be that this court is so extreme that they will create entirely new law, but there was absolutely no reason that this should have come to that. I mean, look, Trump versus Anderson, the 14th Amendment case, I think if we needed anything to put the lie to the idea that this court was in fact controlled by an idea of originalism, of what the founders, what the drafters intended, that case, I think, put an end to that. Because, that was a situation where what the drafters of the 14th Amendment thought and wanted couldn't have been clearer, that they were specifically intending that somebody running for, more than anything else, president, and particularly, frankly, somebody who had been in that kind of position before, like Jefferson Davis, engaged in insurrection, that person couldn't serve again. This was something where it wasn't some newfangled theory that our lawyers thought up. This was exactly what the people who wrote and voted on that amendment said they wanted to do. And the Supreme Court kind of found they found the one kind of technical jurisdictional out that sort of wasn't obviously laughable. It wasn't embarrassing. It wasn't right, but it wasn't embarrassing. And, it was a way for them to get around doing what the actual drafters of this provision said they wanted to do, which was the thing that this court, that so many members of this court said, was their controlling principle. So, if that's not their controlling principle, what is? And it seems like it's results, which is what these guys said they aren't driven by.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think, let's have a court of two here and bring down the gavel on the idea that these notions of originalism and strict constructionism are complete bullshit. And your case brings that up, but so do plenty of others. So does the treatment of the Second Amendment by the right for the past, XD years. And, what they will see in that, what they want to, they will interpret in the ancillary statements of drafters of these agreements what they want to. They will go as far back into British common law as they would like. They will even increasingly do things like, bring the Bible and other kinds of spurious sources into these cases in order to end up with the decision that they want, which is, in the end, the one thing, as you just said, that they said they wouldn't do: judicial activism. They're making law from the bench via, as I said earlier, kind of contortionist interpretations of words, history, context, and their gut feelings. And the problem is, if they end up there on presidential immunity, you could also then, cede certain degree of immunity to a president, and Trump could get elected. And again, I know you don't take positions in political cases and issues, and I don't want to put you in that position, but you could have another president taking advantage of the loopholes they provided in ways that could be enormously destructive and where there would be no recourse.
I think one thing that we have seen to an alarming extent in recent years is institutions that are tasked with protecting our democracy in key ways, shirking that responsibility and acting as though there isn't a real threat to our democracy, and therefore, we don't have to do things that might be hard for us, that might cause blowback. And that's what the Supreme Court did in the 14th Amendment case. They knew it would be explosive if a court came in and said a leading candidate couldn't serve again. And so they found a reason not to do it, and sort of just decided it would be easier if we pretended that there wasn't an insurrection, there wasn't somebody who tried to put himself in power despite losing an election. That's what the Senate did in its vote on the second impeachment of Donald Trump, where more than 2/3 of senators had come out specifically saying that Donald Trump was responsible, that he did the thing. But they said, people will get mad if we do this, and he's not going to be president anymore. There's no real risk. The House, there was some real courage from some House members, but ultimately the House couldn't get a bipartisan vote to put into place a true bipartisan commission, which should have happened. Sort of again, there have been plenty of instances of real courage, but we have found all of these institutions kind of saying this is going to be hard, and everything will be okay. So we don't have to do the hard thing. And the problem is, there's plenty of evidence that things might not be okay. That we could end up, whether it's next year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, with somebody in the White House who is going to take every opportunity to use every loophole to keep themselves in power. And immunity is about as big a loophole as you could possibly give to future presidents.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, that somebody's going to write a book or many books on this chapter, and we'll call it Profiles in Spinelessness, as opposed to Profiles in Courage. Well, look, no, I'm always glad to have the chance to talk. I hope you found it as therapeutic as I did. And I know that our listeners will as well, and hopefully we'll have you back again sometime, perhaps even in the context of, good news about this system, although I'm not optimistic. But I hope that happens soon. Until then, be well. Thank you very much. And to all of you who are listening, join us again for this each and every week, and all our other podcasts each and every day. Until then, bye-bye.